Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt.
I want to wake up. You're not going to wake up. You're in a deep sleep. You're comfortable, relaxed. This is not going to trouble you. Go on. You can remember everything now. It's right over my right. God. What is it? And I try to maintain control so Betty cannot tell I am scared. God, I'm scared. It's all right. You can go right on, experience it. It will not hurt you now. I got to get my gun. All right. All right. That's all. Stop. Go to sleep, Steve. You forget now. Oh, you forget it now. You've forgotten. Calm now. Relaxed. Deeply relaxed.
That was an excerpt from the hypnosis tapes of Barney Hill. The Betty and Barney Hill UFO case will have happened 60 years ago this coming September. This was the UFO case that really brought the phenomena to the mainstream as not only being one of the first widely publicized UFO encounters, but certainly the first encounter that involved abduction. Betty and Barney experienced missing time that was later discovered to be the time that they were brought aboard an alien craft. There they were examined and questioned in a manner that bordered on the non-consensual. Betty's experience seemed to be more positive as she was given a tour of the craft and was shown a star map that would later become a crucial part of her testimony as to the authenticity of the experience. Barney was troubled by his experience and spent years grappling with it, and later developed health issues that may have directly stemmed from the stress that derived from his perception of his experience. Betty's niece, Kathleen Marden, was around when all of this was happening and went on to become a UFO researcher herself. She recently co-authored a book with Stanton Friedman documenting Betty and Barney's experience and how it changed their lives forever, called Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And she's here today to speak with me about it. I start off the conversation by asking Kathleen what the historical significance of the Betty and Barney Hill case was.
Well, I think that the historical significance is that it was the first scientifically investigated case of alien abduction in the United States, and we did not know of any other case before that.
Yeah, and this was the kind of the case that brought it all to the mainstream, right?
Yes, I believe that it was. And in this particular case, you had two highly credible, well-respected witnesses, and you also had physical evidence that wasn't investigated initially because no one had done that before.
Sure. And I think there might have been a few sightings of UFOs here and there, but I don't think anybody before them really were reporting an abduction.
You had the contactees from the early 50s, but it was totally different. It was not an abduction. It was contact that was agreed upon. And then there was a case of abduction that was reported in either 1954 or 1956. I'm not certain which. But I think it was reported to NICAP, but it wasn't investigated because it was thought of as being ridiculous. And back in those days, the scientific investigation of UFOs was fairly new for civilian groups, although NICAP was comprised of scientists and a lot of former military and CIA people. So I think that that is the reason why all of this was so new when Betty and Barney made their report, because nothing like this had been investigated. In fact, NICAP thought if anyone had made more than one UFO report in a lifetime, they weren't credible.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's quite a criteria.
Yes, absolutely.
And the thing is too, as you said, they both had very respectable and credible backgrounds. So they had a lot to lose by reporting this, right?
They never wanted their story to be made public. They were asked by the chief of police in Newton, New Hampshire, to make a report to Pease Air Force Base. He happened to be visiting my childhood home. He was my father's best friend, stopped by for coffee every night on his way home from work. And he was there when my mother and Betty were on the phone. My mother was Betty's sister. So he said that Pease Air Force Base had notified all the police departments that if anyone had a UFO sighting, they should report it to Pease. So the next day, Betty and Barney made their report to Pease Air Force Base. And then Betty was a very curious woman. She was highly intelligent, pretty well educated for that time frame. And so she went to the Portsmouth Public Library and took out the first book she had ever read on the topic. And it was written by Major Donald Kehoe, who was then the director of NICAP. So she and Barney sat down and she wrote a letter to NICAP that outlined the flight pattern of the craft, how long they saw it for, the fact that Barney had seen figures dressed in black shiny uniforms on the craft. That had frightened him greatly, that he'd developed a mental block after that, and that they were seeking the services of a qualified hypnotist. So that was essentially what was in that letter. But a lot unfolded from there. Yeah, that's for sure.
And Barney ended up really it really weighed on him heavily because he was I think he prided himself in being a very rational, level-headed person.
He was.
And he wanted to deny this as on all levels, didn't he?
He absolutely did. When he first saw it, when he was standing in the field, looking through binoculars, shaking his head, pulling the binoculars down, saying, it can't be, but it is. It's there. And when they arrived home, he said to Betty, I don't want to ever tell anyone about this. No good can come of it. Let's just try to forget about it. But Betty, being the person that she was not willing to do that. So while Barney was attempting to forget, Betty was attempting to learn, to become more knowledgeable about this, what happened to them.
Sure. And there's a whole other layer, too, of maybe why they didn't want attention drawn to them, especially at this point in history, because they were a mixed-race couple. So that was something that was not very common at that time, too, right?
That's correct. They were a mixed-race couple in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There were other mixed-race couples around that they socialized with, and there Portsmouth has a long history of African American history. In fact, there was a book written as a Black History Museum in Portsmouth. There's the Black walk through Black Portsmouth, that sort of thing. I know the woman who has written a book on that, Valerie Cunningham, and she knew Barney. Her parents were also knew Barney. She was very young during that time frame, but she ended up becoming a historian and set up an archival collection at the University of New Hampshire on civil rights activities and the Black history of Portsmouth. So Barney was part of that, and I donated some of his civil rights work to that collection.
Nice. Very nice. So what drew you to further investigate your aunt's UFO experience?
Well, I think that this happened because around probably 1985 to 1990, in that time frame, I was watching television shows where skeptics were brought out, and they were telling a different version than I remembered of what happened to the hills. And so I thought, well, there's a possibility that over time my memory has altered, morphed, and that I'm remembering it incorrectly. So I decided that I wanted to find out exactly what did happen. And so I went to the archives, essentially, the Project Blue Book record report, Walter Webb's investigations. And Walter Webb was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. He was the investigator who was assigned to investigate Betty's and Barney's case. He was the original investigator. I interviewed Betty at length. I have her entire collection. I'm the trustee of the estate, and I set up a copy of all of that, the original copy of all of that, at the University of New Hampshire. But I wanted to learn everything I could. I approached it skeptically. In that time frame, Betty and I traveled along that close encounter route time and time again. I also traveled along it with my husband, so I could look at it differently, so I could explore to see if there was any way that Betty and Barney could have been mistaken, could have turned off the highway onto a dirt road or a back road and simply became lost. My husband and I drove the entire route from Niagara Falls through southern Ontario and into Quebec. We stopped 112 miles west of Montreal, just as Betty and Barney did, for the night, and went on, engaged in the activities that they engaged in Montreal, and on the way home as well. And I by that time had pretty much memorized the hypnosis tapes. I had transcribed them for comparative analysis as well. So it was sort of fun riding along and looking at the scenery that Barney had described in 1961. So I really enjoyed that part of it. And then knowing what happened in different parts of northern New Hampshire as they made their way south. So my husband and I did that entire trip. One of the debunkers, or I shouldn't say debunkers, he put the bunk in. He didn't take it out. One of the skeptics said that Betty and Barney had been traveling for something like 16 hours straight, which was total baloney. That maybe during the entire trip, but certainly not straight. They'd stopped for the night twice. And so he said that they had to have been hallucinating by the time they saw the UFO. And so my husband and I wanted to know if we would be hallucinating. So that was part of what I wanted to do too.
And did you? Did you guys
No,
hallucinate?
we were not hallucinating.
Yeah, they didn't. They didn't strike me from what I gathered from reading the book Captured as people that were prone to hallucination. They seemed
No,
pretty even keeled.
absolutely. They were
Yeah.
both, serious, rational people. Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney had served honorably in the Army. He worked for the U.S. Post Office. They were both actively involved in the civil rights movement. So, just really good civic citizens of
So
New
yeah,
Hampshire.
there's so many layers of that to me, I mean, not that I need much convincing because I have an open mind and I believe that people have these experiences, but there's so many levels of reasons that they had no compunction at all to want to fib about this, to want to tell a lie about it, like they
Right,
had a reputation first and foremost. They didn't want
absolutely.
any more, yeah, they didn't want any more attention brought to them. They tried to, at least Barney did, try to deny that it even occurred, for such a long time. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's strange that they received so much criticism and so many people trying to catch them in a lie that it just seems ridiculous. I wonder if they would be met with the same derision today.
I don't think that they would because we're well aware of other cases that also had considerable amount of evidence. And we know a lot more about UFOs now. We know about the UAP videos that the Navy has taken, the 3 that have been released from the radar film, and that the Navy has acknowledged that it doesn't belong to us. Uh, it doesn't appear to belong to any other country on this earth. So yeah, it's a lot different. Back in the early days, the government was very interested in studying these phenomena. In 1952, uh, there was a major study done when Edward Ruppelt was the director of Project Blue Book, and he had more than 1,500 cases at that time, and it was done very scientifically, a study of the UFO reports, and there was a chi-square quality analysis done as well. And he tried to have them categorized into things like balloons, conventional craft, meteorological phenomena, astronomical phenomena, psychological hoax, things like that.
Swamp
And
gas.
in the end, 26.94% were true unknowns. They did another study in 1955, this time 3,201 cases. It was the largest study that the Air Force ever did on UFOs, another chi-square analysis. It was done at the prestigious Battelle Memorial Institute. And in that study, 21.5% were true unknowns. So pretty high percentages, but the decision was made to cover the presence up by the CIA. They were worried about national security. And this remained for a long time. They thought about releasing a little bit of information, but they would gauge the public's response. And if there was public hysteria, then the lid would clamp shut again. And the unfortunate thing is that people's lives were ruined because of the criticism, job loss, that sort of thing. They did not deserve this. Most credible people did not go forward with their story. It was brought forth in the news media, for example, with Travis Walton. Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker called the police department and went to the police department and that information was released. And then 3 women in Kentucky in that same time frame didn't announce their story to anyone. Then the 3 of them were abducted. It was carried to the news by somebody else. So this happened over and over again, but these people were lambasted.
Yeah, it's too bad. So you were alive at the time that this happened, this initial encounter happened. What do you remember from that time period? Like, what were your impressions of what was going on?
I was 13, and I arrived home from school in the afternoon, and my mother was on the telephone with my Aunt Betty. We called her Eunice. That was her real name, Eunice Elizabeth Hill. Well, maiden name was Barrett, but then Hill. So my mother was on the phone with her and was concerned, and Betty was concerned that she and Barney might have been contaminated. We had a neighbor who was a physicist, and she wanted my mother to speak with our neighbor to just to ask what he would suggest they do. They had already taken long showers because they had felt when they arrived home, they said they felt very clammy, much dirtier than they would have on a normal trip. They both felt as if they'd been contaminated by something. And now maybe it was yeast or fungus that they were contaminated with. But anyway, so my mother called the physicist, and he said to Betty, if she had a compass, she should take it to the car to see how the needle of the compass would react. And that's not going to measure radiation, that's for sure. It would measure a magnetic field. We know that there's going to be one up at the hood of the car. But she went along the side of the car, and then she went to the trunk of the car, and she saw shiny spots that hadn't been there the previous day. And she held the compass over those spots, and the needle whirled. And she thought, well, maybe she was doing it. Maybe her hand was moving. So she put the compass down on the metallic surface, and it still whirled. And so she was perplexed by this. Her neighbors came down to see it. She wanted Barney to look at it, but Barney was not interested, of course. He was still trying to forget about all of this. But finally, he was sort of shamed into going out after all the neighbors went. And he finally did go out, and he tried the compass. It did the same thing for him that it did for Benny. And he said, "Oh, it's just a cheap compass, Betty." So, denial. I think that's why Barney became so ill.
Yeah, absolutely. It seemed like it really kind of ate him up.
It did. It really did.
Yeah, that's too bad. Have you had any sort of UFO encounters of any kind, even sightings?
When I was 17 years old, it was February of 1966, and there were a lot of UFO sightings in southern New Hampshire. It was during a time when Betty was experimenting with a team of scientists who were asking her to call in craft. And, I wonder if all of this, the presence of craft in those days, had anything to do with her effort to call them in. But anyway, I did go with Betty, my grandmother, mother, family friend, and my brother to a little lake near my house when I was growing up, Country Pond. And craft had been seen in that area. Craft had landed in that area as well. And my friend, who was walking home at night, it was safe then, had observed a craft, and one had come so low she felt like she was being pulled toward it. And so Betty and Barney came down, and we decided we would go out with her to try to identify what was going on. And we did see what appeared to be a craft rising up from a swampy area. I don't think it was swamp gas.
Mm-hmm.
And so we continued driving down to the area of the lake where that was. And there was a craft hovering over the lake. It lifted up and it traveled in front of us. We had gotten out of the car and gone down on the public beach. It was February. There was ice, and we were standing on the ice. Betty had a flashlight. I think my mother had a flashlight. And also they were smoking cigarettes and trying to signal this craft. And it came over in front of us, and it lifted up and went above the treetops and around to another section of the lake. So we returned to the car and drove down to that section of the lake. We had to cross a bridge to a little island and then turn around, and Betty parked on the bridge. She was the driver. And we all got out of the car, and we were looking for this craft. All of us, except for my mother, were looking in one direction. My mother was looking in the other, on the other side of the bridge. And she saw what appeared to be two craft hovering over the ice. And then one of them, in kind of a measured way, had some kind of light. It wasn't like turning on a light and the beam is suddenly there. It came toward her in a measured way. And she yelled. And we went running to her and got into the car and left that area and went back to the public beach. And there we saw the craft come around toward us. It rose up into the air and sort of they called it a falling leaf pattern or a rocking pattern. It rocked down toward the ground or over the ice, and then it ascended vertically. And we went back to the car, and it traveled over the trees. I didn't see it, but Betty said it was over the trees. I guess from my vantage point in the back seat, I couldn't see it. Until we left and we went back to my grandparents' home. Barney and my grandfather said that they wished they had come with us because the television reception was terrible that night, and we wondered if the craft had anything to do with that.
Interesting.
So that was a UFO sighting that I had. I had other sightings too over my lifetime. There was one that landed on my grandparents' farm. I didn't see it, but there were two observers who saw it coming in. It left physical trace evidence, so I was over there to see that evidence. And then when I lived in Colorado, I did graduate work in Cincinnati and was married. My husband was getting his doctorate in the philosophy of psychiatry. And we had a falling out and split, and I went to Colorado. And when I was in a small town in Colorado, I saw a UFO, and my neighbors actually saw UFOs over my homes, two different locations, twice.
Interesting.
Yes.
But no recollection of any sort of interaction or abduction. That's the word I'm looking for.
I think that, yes, I did have memories. And they were frightening memories. I think the first one occurred back when that craft landed on my grandparents' farm, 200 feet from my childhood home. My mother and I remembered finding ourselves on the craft. Mm-hmm. And wow. Dr. James Harder from APRO, he was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And he investigated our case, hypnotized us, but we insisted upon confidentiality. And I was going to take that to my grave, really. I was visited periodically throughout my lifetime. It's been probably 6 or 7 years since my last contact, physical contact. I've had I felt presence, but was not able to see these higher vibrating dimensional entities, but received telepathic communication. But so it appears that the type of experience has changed from being taken to craft and developing all of those symptoms that near-death experiencers have, that our studies indicate it is prevalent in most abductees who have been taken to craft. And then to move on to having non-physical presence and sort of telepathic communication from time to time. Not much recently, though.
Mm-hmm. Was it a positive experience, or was it, I mean, you said that it was frightening, but I think sometimes it's frightening for people because they don't know what's happening. Not necessarily because something negative is happening, but did it seem like a consensual experience for you?
Well, first, let me say that I think that fear colors our perception of what has occurred.
Sure.
And I was so fearful that I felt I was being exploited. I thought something horrible was happening to me. I was traumatized. I had a lot of working through to do.
Sure.
But in terms of the memories, and I did have some conscious recall, it wasn't all produced through hypnosis. And it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. They seemed kind of nice. I mean, they were the same ones who had contact with Betty and Barney. And in fact, I know that for certain because I said to my aunt one time, I didn't like that little one that stood in the doorway when I was taken to craft. And she said, "How did you know about him?" Said, because I interacted with him. I didn't like him at all.
Interesting.
I mean, just like some humans are not nice. This guy was not nice. And but the escort that I had, who came to get me time and time again, or met me on craft time and time again, was very nice and respectful. And it seemed like, he showed me things and tried to make me understand things. So as I reflect upon it, I have to say, I can't say it was a highly positive experience because I wasn't given a lot of information. They did send intense feelings of love toward me. They projected that toward me, which felt very nice, and I felt like I had no reason to fear them. But there wasn't a lot of education or interaction until I was older. And those just the genetic or the DNA samples were taken when I was younger, and also scoop marks. They told me that the samples of the tissue samples they were taking from me were to measure the level of toxicity in my body, and I thought about that, and I think that there's reason for that because probably less than a mile as the crow flies from my childhood home was a toxic waste dump.
Oh, wow.
It ended up being a Superfund site. And then 20 miles from my home was a nuclear base. And then across the river from that was another nuclear base, a Navy base.
Whoa.
Portsmouth
That's
Naval
a lot.
Shipyard. So there was a lot of radiation. They were around a lot, too, when Seabrook nuclear power plant was being built. So they do not like our use of nuclear weapons, particularly. They tell most experiencers that they fear that we could have a nuclear war, an environmental collapse, And I believe that they have been collecting flora and fauna dating back to the 1950s in kind of a Noah's Ark effort to have this huge catalog of samples, so that if we do destroy this planet, maybe eventually they can establish life here. And they also do this on other planets as well.
And you know that because that's something that they shared with you?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take, or did they tell you why they took DNA samples?
I'm trying to think if they told me why they took my DNA. I don't think they did, but I've worked with probably a couple of thousand experiencers one-on-one, plus did studies with about 5,000. And it appears that they are producing hybrids, at least they were. They say that it is for their benefit and for ours. They're attempting to produce a more sustainable human and a more sustainable whatever they are, too, whether it's a mantis type or a gray or whatever.
What were the kinds of being, or I should say, was there more than one kind of being that you had interactions with?
I had interaction with two types of grays. There were the small ones who are just the guards or the supervisors or the assistants. They make sure that you don't get off the craft with anything. They come and they take you and then they return you. They dropped me once. That was no fun. I was injured. But they were very careful after that. I remember when they were putting me back in bed, one was on one side and then one was on the other, and one was standing beside the bed. And I could kind of hear a little bit of sound. I can't even describe what the sound was, kind of like a whooshing sound or something. And they were being so careful about the way they put me back into that bed with, the covers just so and my body just so. It was pretty funny as I think back at it after they made that mistake. But so it's them. And then there were the taller ones. And they were, about 5 feet tall, maybe a little taller than that. And just about my size. I'm 5 feet tall. And they looked different from the little ones. They were more like sentient beings, I might say. I wasn't frightened to look at them. They didn't look like us. Their eyes were larger. No visible ears, a little tiny nose, a slit for a mouth, telepathic communication, kind of intense when you're receiving that kind of communication. But that's what I remember from it.
Yeah, I've heard the smaller ones sort of described as almost like emotionless, very robotic in a sense.
Well, they might be bio-robotic
yeah, that's what I've heard.
And it makes sense to me. I wish I could speak with them again because I'd like to ask that question. But we know they will stand up against the wall and they only move when they're instructed to do so. And it makes sense to me that if you're going to have a base here on Earth, you would not want to have a huge number of sentient beings there, in terms of eating and waste and sustaining that base. But if you had robotic creatures that just did that kind of work, it would be a lot more reasonable to me, more efficient, So you wouldn't have to provide beds for them to sleep in. You wouldn't,
Sure.
that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never
And
thought
you
about it that way.
wouldn't have to worry about them having negative interactions with one another.
Yeah, exactly. That would be easy to choreograph, easy to control. Yeah. Well, back to the Betty and Barney case for a
Yes.
bit. They obviously did not want their case to go public initially, and then somebody else ended up breaking the case. And so what happened after that? What came after it all went public?
Well, it went public in the Boston Traveler, and Betty and Barney were extremely upset. It ran for 5 days. The first night, they went to the home of a friend who was an officer on Pease Air Force Base, and stayed with him and his wife for the evening until they felt like it was safe to go home, that the reporters had left and the phone had stopped ringing. The second night, they went to my grandparents' house, and we met as a family and decided what to do next, because this had an impact not only on Betty and Barney, but on the entire family. And so we made the decision together that we thought that since the story had already been told, that Betty and Barney should speak about it. And so a few days later, they spoke at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire, to an overflow crowd, and they were introduced by the public information officer at Pease Air Force Base. And so it was really nice for them to be introduced by him. And they told about their sighting, the close encounter, but they didn't talk about the abduction itself. John G. Fuller happened to be there that night. John was a professional writer who was in town doing research on his book, The Incident at Exeter. And that was the case in Exeter, New Hampshire, where 2 police officers and a 18-year-old man had a close encounter with a UFO. And so he introduced himself to Barney. Betty had already met him because she would visit the Exeter Police Department to check on the foster children that she was supervising. And so he proposed that he would like to write a book about their incident. And Betty and Barney thought about it. He gave them a proposal, and they finally decided that they would permit him to do that as long as it focused on the hypnosis and as long as Dr. Benjamin Simon would take part in that. And he faced many challenges in writing the book, but eventually he did write the book, and it was the New York Times bestseller. It ended up being published in several different languages, went around the world. It was very popular. And then the movie, Let There Be Light. No, not Let. That was Dr. Simon's movie. What am I saying? I told you I was tired from working really hard the past few days. But
I understand.
Anyway, it was the UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons. Barney was deceased at that point. He, at age 46, had a massive cerebral hemorrhage in February of 1969. It was really tragic. And I moved in with Betty after that. I was a college student at UNH. So then Betty continued her work in social work. I didn't tell you that Barney, I don't know if you knew this, in 1965 was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and received an award from Sergeant Shriver for the work that he did setting up the poverty program in Rockingham County, New Hampshire, where he and Betty lived. And also he received an award from the Archdiocese for setting up their literacy program. He and Betty were working on setting up literacy programs because in New Hampshire you had to take a literacy test before you could vote. So that was the reason for that. So he and Betty were very much into their work in the community and in the state when they were invited guests at Lyndon Johnson's inauguration in January of 1965. And they were role models for me. And so I was invited too and went. That
Wonderful.
was really, really a huge treat. I'll never forget it. It was fantastic. And so Betty went on with her job as a social worker, but a lot of things were happening to her after Barney died. There were a few odd things in the house before he passed, but afterward, it seemed as if there was a psychological operation that was set up in order to break Betty. But Betty was a very strong and secure and stable person. But weird things were done. And one thing was the house was entered, and for clothing was removed from the closet, coats, and just put in a heap on the floor with Barney's scarf piled over the top of it. When I was living there, I had the apartment downstairs. Betty owned an apartment house. And so I knew her house was being entered, but I just heard someone go in the back door of her house. So I thought, oh, Betty has stopped in maybe to have lunch. So I went up the stairs and she wasn't there. So I thought, well, maybe she just picked something up and left. I went back downstairs and sat down to begin studying again. And all of a sudden I heard a huge crash, bang, running, heavy footsteps. And I went running up the stairs. The closet door was open. Betty's baseball bat was on the floor. It's a good thing I didn't open the door. The front door to her apartment was wide open. The front door to the apartment building was wide open. The gate was open. And there was a man in a kind of a brownish suit running up the street. Common burglars don't wear suits.
Exactly. And that was so long after the fact, after the initial encounter. What interest? I mean, it had long been public at this point, right?
It had been, but I do know that it ramped up when Philip Klass came on in 1966. And he was I think the most prolific anti-UFO propagandist of the 20th century, and a nasty one at that. I don't know if this was by his design or by someone else's design, but in 1966, the fall of 66, the book was published. By February of 1969, a little bit more than 2 years, Barney was dead. So the book was still pretty much in full swing. At that point, Betty and Barney had been appearing on television shows to promote the book and had been on a lot of radio shows. So there'd been a lot of publicity. And I have a feeling that someone was trying to intimidate Betty so that she would stop the publicity and just let the whole thing die. It ramped up again just before and after the movie was made for television movie aired. And I know that Philip Klass was very actively involved in that. In fact, he wrote a threatening letter to Betty. He visited Dr. Simon's home. I think he probably threatened Dr. Simon because Dr. Simon made a public statement after that saying that although he believed that Betty and Barney were telling the truth, that this hadn't happened to anyone else, and there was no scientific evidence to support the idea that this was real, and therefore he had to reject it. Now, there was scientific evidence, but it wasn't really investigated until the 1970s.
That's so strange. Wasn't there a point, too, where Betty was trying to actually arrange a meeting with the aliens?
Yes, she was, and that is when she was working with the team of scientists that I talked about. They would give her a script that she was to read. And in my book, you'll see exactly what they wrote one time, a chart they had drawn out. And she would go onto her back porch every night at the same time and attempt to send messages to these extraterrestrials. And the scientific team would use certain words or coordinates and ask Betty to send the craft there. And then they would go out and look for it. Another thing that she was doing was attempting to have a craft land on my grandparents' farm. When that craft landed,
Didn't something happen where it ended up actually going to someplace down the road or to a different house?
well, there's one that landed on my grandparents' farm. There was one that landed at the home of in the backyard, actually, of some people who lived 2 houses away.
And you got the wrong address.
And then on the night that all of the scientists were gathered, and Jacques Vallée was there, Dr. Simon was there, John Fuller was there too. Betty had been working for only a couple of weeks. She recorded the length of time that it took for her messages to be carried out. And she said it was at least a month, I think she said. But this was something that was arranged very, very rapidly. There was some funding, and boom, that was it. Not giving Betty a chance to even do her work, her part of it. But a craft was seen on the other side of town. There were a couple of, one was an astronomer. They were NICAP investigators. And I think that this was on the second try that they had a craft that came down very close in their backyard.
Interesting. Did any of this have anything to do with the new moccasin experiment?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you explain to the listeners what that is?
Yes, there was a new moccasin experiment that was a word that the scientists gave to Betty as a place where they wanted this craft to land by New Moccasin Street, I guess it was. And so they went out, and there actually was a craft that was observed that night. But then they looked, and in the history of UFO sightings, there was another sighting with a word moccasin. It was, I don't know if it was Moccasin Street or what, but moccasin was used. And so they said that even though they saw the craft and Betty carried out the experiment, they could not state that it was Betty who caused this to occur, that it could have been coincidence.
A pretty astounding one.
It was a pretty astounding one, I agree.
And an important element, too, that Betty brought from her encounter was a star map. What was the deal with that?
Well, when Betty was on the craft and the examiner left her to go in to examine Barney, she was left alone with the one that she called the leader. And she lost her fear of him because he had taken away her pain when the examiner inserted a needle into her navel. So she was up, and she'd put her dress back on, and she was looking around. She saw what she called a book. It wasn't what we think of as a book today. It was more something like a tablet, as she described it to me. And so she had that, and she said to the leader, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And so he produced from a kind of a little hole or something in the wall that opened up this three-dimensional star map. In her dream, she had a series of dreams, and she dreamed about a star map, but on that it was like a classroom star map that opened like a window shade. That's not what she saw on the craft. And there were several stars on it. Two in the foreground were as large as nickels. They were connected by 5 lines. There were others that were much smaller that were connected by 2 lines. One of them was connected by 3 lines. And then those were solid lines, meaning that they were trade routes. There were also other stars that were connected by dotted lines, which meant that they were expeditions. And then there were 3 stars that were not connected by lines at all. And then she had just drawn little dots all over. That was the result of post-hypnotic suggestion that Betty would go home and draw that as long as she could remember it accurately, and that it didn't bother her too much. Fortunately, Betty had a terrific memory, unbelievable memory. And so she did go home and she drew it. And then rationality overtook her, and she changed the angle on one of the lines after she thought and thought about it. So that book was published in the book that John Fuller wrote, the first book. And Marjorie Fish, who was a brilliant woman from Ohio, saw that map in the book. And she was skeptical, but she was an amateur astronomer. She was also a school teacher and a member of Mensa. And she thought that if this place existed in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years, that she might be able to find it. So she went to the university and she sat and had to hand copy all of the distance data and all of the characteristics of all of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years from the sun in all directions. And then she went home and she started to build models to see if she could find the configuration that Betty had drawn. And over the years, she had actually built 14 of these 3D models, and still didn't have a match until a new catalog was released at the end of 1971. In 1972, she was able to get better distance data. We had made technological progress, and so she copied all of that down, and she went back and she built a model. And in this, she had the new distance data. And when she looked up into this model, there was a match for what Betty had sketched.
Oh, wow.
So this was huge. But Marjorie then wanted somebody to vet her work, scientists, to vet her work for accuracy. And this is where Stanton Friedman came in. Coral Lorenzen, who was the co-director of the Aerial Research Phenomena organization, asked Stanton to meet with Marjorie when he was in Ohio. And if he thought that she was credible, that would he help her? And so Stanton met with her, and he told me that he thought that Marjorie probably was far better at speaking with scientists than with the general public. And he agreed to find a scientist. That scientist was Alan Hynek. He and Marjorie went to Northwestern University and took her model and took her paper and presented all of the information. And he vetted Marjorie's work and said that it was accurate. So this was a big deal. David Saunders, a statistician who was one of the chief investigators for the scientific study on UFOs, the one who found the infamous trick memo, was another one who vetted Marjorie's work. And he said that the chance of Betty sketching this and coming up with this configuration by chance would have been 1 in 10,000, except for one angle was a little off. Mm-hmm. And that angle was the one, I think, that she erased and then let her rational mind take over. So it was 1 in 1,000, but that's still quite high.
Absolutely.
And then finally, the University of, or Ohio State University, astronomy department, they had computers at this point, did computerized models of Marjorie's map and said that her work was accurate. And then Stanton was so impressed with all of this that he was the first to publish in a magazine on this. And then he spoke to Terence Dickinson, who was an astronomer at Astronomy Magazine. And he wrote an article on it after he had vetted Marjorie's work. And what he found is that all of the stars on Betty's map were connected by lines, were sun-like stars, even though only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years are sun-like stars. And all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space were on Betty's map. So that was really extraordinary. Yeah. Not only that, if we were astronauts and we lived on Zeta Reticuli, those were the two large ones, Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, in the constellation the Net, that can be observed as a tiny, tiny dot in the southern hemisphere. So if we were living in one of those star systems and we wanted to come to planet Earth, we would travel the same routes that were laid out on the map that Betty drew. And it had special characteristics. All of those star systems are in a plane, so it would be easier to go from one to another. Whereas if they were in like a loaf of raisin bread, all long distances from one another and not in a plane, it would have been much more difficult. So that map made sense to the astronomers who looked at it and knew all of the work that Marjorie done and took it seriously. There were other astronomers who just wrote it off and said, oh, I could find that if I threw marbles into a sand pile, that sort of thing. But it wouldn't have those characteristics.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is
really
amazing.
Incredible. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I know we're closing in on an hour, but do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yes,
I do. Would you be open to do that? Okay.
Yes.
Because I think they're an important part of this whole story.
Okay.
Because they happen towards the end of this whole adventure that Betty and Barney went on. At this point, only Betty. But why do you think that Betty began to get frustrated with NICAP standards and began to set up her own group?
Well, NICAP was just so close-minded. They were not accepting reality as she knew it. She was investigating cases. She joined APRO and investigated abduction cases for APRO. But she formed her own group, the Silent Network, and these were people who would just go out and watch for UFOs. And then they would report them to Betty if they had UFO sightings with all of the details. So I think that she was very critical of the UFO groups who knew so little, who focused on only the nuts and bolts and would not look beyond that. They were very close-minded about UFOs and remained in ignorance because they weren't willing to go beyond the nuts and bolts. And, so they were kind of like wearing blinders, Betty said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And here she was conducting CE5 experiments with a team of scientists. I mean, I can understand that entirely because I've been part of a CE5 experiment a couple of times and have seen craft.
Mm-hmm. Oh, CE5, yeah. That's Dr. Stephen Greer's stuff.
Yeah, he was the one who started it, but Betty was doing it before him.
Sure, exactly. She just didn't have an app.
Yeah, she
to do
didn't
that
have an
with.
app. She wasn't teaching people to do it, and she, she wasn't. I don't know. Well, she wasn't doing it anyway. She was just doing it for a team of scientists. But then she went on and did it herself, too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. I like that aspect of it. Personally calling in a close encounter instead of just sort of happening upon one by just random circumstance, although I doubt there's any randomness to it, or having it be something that's, there's not a consensual interaction. I like that it's something that you invite in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the last question, and I think it's really an interesting turn of events here, is what eventually, Betty had a change of heart in regards to UFOs and people who claimed to be abducted by them. What happened? What caused her to turn in that direction?
Betty was very concerned that people who were not in the mental health field, people who were not clinically trained hypnosis practitioners were using their self-styled methods of hypnosis. They were working with individuals and creating more problems. They might have been making suggestions to individuals and leading people to believe things that didn't happen. There was a lot of fraud, Betty thought, going on in the UFO field regarding abductees, and especially when there was absolutely no history of UFO sightings and no history of having conscious recall of any kind of encounter. It really bothered her when people were dreaming only or in bed at night and being taken through solid surfaces. Betty wasn't willing to believe that. I talked to 3 theoretical physicists who told me that that's absolutely possible, and we've done it on a very small scale in a laboratory. But that was after Betty had passed. So, just the level of knowledge that she had in that time frame caused her to be highly critical. She didn't want to see people being hurt. She endorsed the cases that she knew were real, that where people were indeed having experiences. But she thought that there was a Me Too group who, people who might have had psychological problems, who were using a UFO abduction to try to explain their mental health problems that way.
Sure. Yeah, interesting. What a tale. What a life of this whole story. There's so much to it. I mean, we've just barely scraped the surface, but it's an incredible book, the captured book that just came out recently. I highly suggest anybody listening to look into it for sure. Kathleen, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat about it. It's been great.
Thanks for having me. And I just want to mention that the new book, the 60th anniversary book, has new information, scientific information, and analyses that have been done over the past 14 years. So some really exciting information in the book.
Yeah. And I also listened to the audiobook, which also there is a link that's given there to extra stuff, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can go to a website and there's some extra things, some kind of like bonus features too, which I thought was really, really cool. Yeah.
Okay.
Where can people find the book actually?
The book is available in bookstores and online bookstores. If you'd like an autographed copy, you can purchase it on my website at Kathleen with a K dash or hyphen Marden, MARDEN.com.
Fantastic. We'll include the link in the episode notes so people can just have easy access to it should they care to get it that way. So,
okay, thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you so much, Kathleen, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I will send you a link when this goes live.
Okay, thank you very much.
If you like what you've heard and would like to contribute to The Melt, there are a few ways that you can do so. The most tangible way would be financially by clicking the Patreon link in the episode notes, and there you will find a multitude of ways that you can help for as little as $1 a month. This helps to keep making The Melt better, pay the bills, and help to make this podcast my full-time job that I can fully devote my time to and give you more content. Another way of helping would be by going to wherever it is that you subscribe to The Melt and give it a favorable review or rating that will help to get it out to more people. And lastly, if neither of those options are readily available, simply send your good thoughts and intentions. In an interconnected and quantumly entangled multiverse, these also go a long way. Thank you.